morning is from the middle of the story that we're looking at this morning. It's the story of the Exodus. I'm going to read from Exodus, the 12th chapter, starting at the 29th verse. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Rise up, go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you said. Take your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too." This is the word of the Lord. The family came home after church, sat down, had dinner as they always do, and then the dad said to the kids, "Well, what did you learn in Sunday school this morning?" Well, little Johnny politely raised his hand and said, "I know, Dad, I can say." "Well, little Johnny, tell me what you learned this morning." "Well, we learned about Moses, General Moses, the desert general, the desert ninja SEAL general." And they were all somewhat stunned. And he continued, "General Moses got a call from the president to go to Egypt and swoop in and take the Hebrews out before the Pharaoh knew about it. And they did. He and his lieutenant Aaron went into Egypt, and they got all the Hebrews, and they went across. They got them out, and they crossed the Red Sea Bridge, which is a very long bridge. And the Egyptians woke up in the middle of the night and realized that their captives were leaving, and they got into their armed chariots and started crossing the bridge. By the time they got there, the Israelites, the Hebrews, had already gotten off the bridge. So General Moses told the SEAL Team 6 to go blow the bridge. And he did, and they did, and all of the Egyptians crashed into the Red Sea. And the Hebrews got away. They were taken to the helicopter landing center and were evac out. Well, the family was stunned. And when he recovered his composure, the dad said, "Johnny, is that what they taught you this morning?" Johnny said, "Well, not exactly, Dad, but you wouldn't believe the stuff they told us in Sunday school." This is a fantastic story. This story of the Exodus of God's people out from under the oppression of the Pharaoh. We recall the story. Last week we talked about Joseph and how Joseph came to Egypt because of the famine in the Middle East, in his country. And he ended up bringing his entire family. That family grew until it was, gosh, who knows how many people were there? Over 400,000 people. Some estimate up to 2 million. They had 400 years of time that they spent in Egypt, most of which was in slavery and under the oppression of the Pharaoh. And the people groaned, and God heard their groaning. And God sent Moses to take them out of Egypt. and to save the people. This is a fantastic story. It's a story that, well, you've seen the story on the movie, on TV, the Ten Commandments. You know what Moses looks like. He looks sort of like Charleston Heston, doesn't he? They wouldn't have cast Charleston Heston if he didn't look like Moses. There's a new one out now called, let's see, it's Exodus, Gods and Kings. I haven't seen it, but I'm anxious to go see it. So this story has all the potential of Hollywood greatness, Hollywood movie. And I hope that when you read the story, when you read the biblical text or the story in the book of the story, that you read it with imagination, that you don't overlook the elements of fantastic in this story. If you do overlook it, if you read it as if it's some sterile, churchy type story that ought to be read with great reverence, you're going to miss the real story. You're just going to miss it. It's a story that draws on some of the elements of its environment, some of the old stories that were around at the time that this story was told. Let me give you an example. You remember how Moses was born and his mom put him in the basket and put him on the Nile River, and the Pharaoh's daughter saw Moses in the basket, and she then hired, actually it ended up being Moses' mother, to come nurse him. She paid Mom to do that. Well, that draws on an ancient story, an ancient Akkadian story about the great king Sargon, which is said Sargon was living about 500-600 years before the time of Moses. And in the Middle East, they have found, archaeologists have found an inscription in a stone where Sargon is telling the story of his own birth. And in Sargon's own birth, his mother gave birth in a secret place, placed him in a basket of reeds that had bitumen on it to keep the water out, and put him in the river. And Sargon was found by Aki, the drawer of water, who adopted Moses and raised him as his own son. And then Sargon, and raised Sargon as his own son. And from those humble beginnings, those very humble beginnings, Sargon became the greatest Akkadian king to ever live. Now, coincidence? No. I think the tellers of the story of Moses drew from that. There's another example, another motif that is in the story. The motif where the Pharaoh's daughter adopts Moses and pays the mother to nurse Moses. Their archaeologists have found an ancient Mesopotamian text that it's a legal text that tells one what one should do if one finds an abandoned child. Now, in the ancient world, abandoned children were something of a problem. If a family could not have a child, didn't feel like they could support it, or for whatever reasons, occasionally they would abandon their children. So that's an awful thing, but it was a fact of the ancient world. It was the ancient equivalent of modern-day abortion. And so this text, this legal text, says that if you find a child that's been abandoned, and it's an infant, then you are supposed to find a nurse that will suckle the child, and then at age 3, the child will be adopted by someone and raised and educated to become a scribe. Isn't that interesting? I just find that amazing. But the story, the importance of the story, is not in the fantasticness of the story itself. It's what it tells us. It's what it tells us about the founding of the nation of Israel. Because in the story, what we have is we have two principles that are beyond the fantastic nature of what we find in the text itself. This is a story about the founding of the nation of Israel. It's a story about how the nation coalesced, how it came together, how these people that were in captive or in slavery came together to become the nation of Israel. And it's not an objective view of the history of this happening. It's a view that says God was involved, and this is how God did this. So it's a story about the coalescing and founding of a nation out of these people that were captive. Now, scholars tell us that the people that were in Israel, in all likelihood, were not only the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They probably, in all likelihood, were people from all over northern Africa and the Middle East. And the reason is because Egypt had one great asset that no other country in the world possessed anything like it. Egypt had the Nile Delta, the most fertile area in the world that they knew. The Nile Delta was almost impervious to any weather changes and the impact on that weather can have, because they had a constant resource of water, and they had the most fertile soil that was washed down that river that was known to humankind. And in times of drought and famine in other parts of the world, people from all over the world would come to Egypt, because Egypt was the breadbasket. And for centuries, Egypt welcomed them until the group that was there when the descendant, or the folks that descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob came and were put into slavery to build the cities that they needed to store their food. So these people were all kinds of different folks, different cultures. And this is the story about how all those disparate folks were drawn together to become the nation of Israel. Now, there are two principles that we find in this story that I think are very important. The first principle is that this is a story about freedom. It's a story about freedom. And it's a story that this idea of freedom, if you ask a Jew, a modern Jew, what the story of what the Passover means to them, in all likelihood, they are going to respond to maybe several different things, but one of those things will be, it's a story about freedom. It's a story where we celebrate freedom. Now, what is freedom? What do we mean by freedom? If you ask an American what freedom is, they're going to say it's an unalienable right, right? An unalienable right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what the Declaration of Independence says it is. And that is what freedom is. Freedom has to do with that. That's political freedom. Now, in all likelihood, the ancient Hebrew had no concept of the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That just wouldn't be on their horizon. It just wouldn't be in their radar screen. But they did have an understanding of freedom, of political freedom, that allowed them, or that would allow them to worship their God. So for them, freedom meant the ability to worship their God. To be free meant that they were free to worship. Now, in the ancient world, if they immigrated from one country to another, they were just simply trading one king for another. So their political systems were not free. Hopefully, if you immigrated, you'd trade a despotic king for a benevolent king. But that was about the best you were going to be able to do. But the ability to worship your God was what was important to them. And it's what coalesced them into a nation. Now, let me read something to you from the ceremony that's used by the Jews still to this day. They've been doing this for 3,000 years, celebrating the Passover. The script that they use for the celebration, which is called the Seder, the script they use is called the Haggadah. In one of the Haggadah, there is a preface that explains a little bit about what this celebration is about. And in the Union Haggadah, is the one that I have in my office, talks about the ceremony and speaks to the emotions that are sparked by the celebration. And this is what the Union Haggadah says about people as they read and go and celebrate the Passover. It says their souls are fired with the love of liberty, and their hearts are roused to greater loyalty to Israel and to Israel's, catch this, to Israel's God of freedom. So the concept of freedom is infused in the Passover and in the story of the Exodus. So that's the first strong principle that we find, is the principle of freedom. The second strong principle that we find in this story is the principle of salvation. You know, sometimes Christians think that they invented the idea of salvation. Well, not so. That idea is as old as creation. The work of God throughout creation has been the work of salvation. God redeems and God saves. The story of the Exodus is the story of God's redeeming of the people for their salvation, to save them. And this is the story that we find acted out over and over and over in the Bible. The people sin. They cry out to God. God hears. God redeems and God saves. And then the people sin again. They forget God. The sin is that they forget God. But God, over and over in the history of humankind, is at work in the world for the salvation of all. And this story was repeated on the cross with Jesus Christ. Christians need to know the story of the Exodus because it informs us about the story of Jesus Christ. We find that on the cross, Jesus Christ died. And in his death, he redeemed us. And 3 days later, he rose from the dead. And in that event of the resurrection, we find the promise of our salvation. God is at work in the world, doing the work of salvation for all. This is the most important story in the Old Testament, the story of the Exodus, because it sets us up to understand the story